me say a great thank you to Jeroen Oomen here, who's joining us today from Utrecht University. You're an assistant professor at the Urban Futures Studio. I have a new book called Captured Futures, Rethinking the Drama of Environmental Politics, which I'm sure you'll be referencing. You spent some time here at Harvard a few years ago. When David Keith was still here, you were embedded, so to speak, in the Keith group, observing, discussing, learning about sort of solar geoengineering from this perspective. And you're also one of the main authors of the non-use agreement, which you may talk about as well. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jeroen, and let me get that door. You got it? And say welcome to Jeroen for coming here, and take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Josh. And thank you all for being here. I'm very excited. I'm going to start off with a couple of disclaimers before I begin, because I am not actually going to talk about the non-use agreement at all. Because I'm not going to talk about why I think geoengineering is dangerous. Specifically, I'm going to zoom out, and I'm going to ask, okay, what is it that makes solar geoengineering potentially appear in climate politics as a realistic option? And that has been the focus of my research for the past 5 or so years after I left the Keith group. And that was what informed me writing the non-use agreement. But before I start, maybe everyone here knows what solar geoengineering is, right? So I don't have to talk about that? Okay, good. Because I don't have it. That was my second disclaimer. The third disclaimer is kind of important. So I'm here now from the Netherlands, and I got to only take a burner laptop because we don't trust your borders anymore. So there will be quite a bit of the slides that might just be looking very bad or ugly, and there may be some chaos in between during the presentation just because this burner laptop is actually a burner laptop. It's terrible, and I'm only allowed to work in the browser. So if anything becomes distracting, tell me. Fourth and final thing, so I'm going to zoom out. I'm coming from a perspective of interpretative political science, which may for a lot of you in the room be different than what you're used to. And this is the first time I'm trying out this particular angle within a more geoengineering oriented crowd. So if anything's unclear or you just fundamentally disagree with me, feel free to interrupt me and have a conversation in between, or in the lecture itself or in the talk. So the background of what I want to talk to you about today is this book, Captured Futures, Rethinking the Drama of Environmental Politics. And it's an analysis of why environmental politics, as we've done it the past half century or so, will not and cannot deliver. And that is because if there's one tagline, it's because we organize out all kinds of cultural concerns around sustainability and only focus on the technical and the economic. And this was always by design, and I will talk you through a little bit of why we think this. So, why do we think it cannot deliver? Well, first, there's the obvious thing that I don't think I need to explain very much in this room. We are just nowhere near the targets that we set. Okay? But we've also constructed a politics that derives its interest, both in public and in the political negotiation, from we need to hit a target. And if we don't hit the target, we need to start thinking about other ways. There is not a politics of aspiration in there. And this will matter tremendously, as I will get to. Secondly, and I'm going to rush through this because I want to get to the geoengineering part, right? So if anything, if I go too quickly, just say so. We've constructed a whole edifice around climate politics. But again, because we've narrowed that, we've organized out other concerns that we give in their own domain. Biodiversity, resource use, and all of these domains we can treat with these targets and gaps. But if we don't treat them in an integrated fashion, again, that's where culture and socioeconomic systems comes in, you're never going to make it, right? Because then we're going to have an escalating series of crisis after crisis after crisis. We call that a little bit of a waterbed effect. You might solve the one thing, but only by kicking the can down the road. Now, another thing that we've organized out quite consistently is the question of justice. Where do we think our resources will come from? But fundamentally, and this is where I wanted to go to, we keep, as we say in Dutch, mopping with the tap running. Right? So this is the idea that, yes, we're trying to solve all these problems, but we're not actually turning off the tap. So we can do all the mopping, but we're still running into more and more problems. And I think, as Dutch people, one of our favorite examples is the SUV occasion, which never used to be in the Netherlands. Right? Every time we come to the US, we're completely baffled by the size of your cars. It doesn't make sense to us at all. But since 2010, roughly, the average new car has gotten a centimeter wider every 2 years. To such an extent that now half the parking spaces in Europe don't actually fit half this new car sold. Now this is funny on the one hand, but it's deeply terrible if we think about it politically and in terms of climate and in terms of resource use, right? So in this SUV, you see why it's important to take aspiration seriously and why it's important to think about it as an integrated fashion. SUVs in and of themselves could significantly enlarge global order. If you just think about the resource cost of SUVs over normal cars, that is about as much aluminum between now and 2050 as we would need for the electrification of our entire sort of electricity system, right? So if we want to have renewables, that takes as much as just the markup that we need to have SUVs over cars. So if we don't take aspirations and culture seriously, we're going to keep running into the same problem. We're solving the one issue, but then over and over again, we run into this other pressure on politics. So we want to expand the notion of what we think is politics, and we want to really think critically about what does that mean for the way that we do science within it. And that's where I will get to geoengineering. So by now, it has kind of become a politics of miracles, right? I think no one here in the room will be surprised or in disagreement if we say, you know what, 1.5 degrees is basically dead. Maybe 2 degrees is even dead. What is interesting is that even the players who you would expect to hold that up are starting to say it is a fantasy. Fatih Birol is the head of the International Energy Agency. Bart van der Hurk is now co-chair of the IPCC. So these are people who are completely bought in to the system. And they must be, right? Because if they start questioning the system, who is still going to defend it? And so our key claim is that we've, over the past 50 years, developed a way of doing politics and allocated a role of science within that politics that will not solve our problems because it has all kinds of implicit strictures, norms, and conventions. We call that, and I'm going to give you a very brief background on where I come from as a scientist, the dramaturgical regime of environmental politics. I come from a field where we read politics as if it's theater, and to really say, well, if politics is theater, it's all about how do you make your performance convincing. And I think it's easy to see in an era of Trump how that can work. But our claim is that that is at the heart of any sort of political work. So what we're interested in is how do we get to aspirations and ideas that have what we call ideological power over us. Ideas that come to steer what we want from life and that come to steer also political decision making. And in environmental politics, these ideas are incredibly narrow. so narrow that, and this is what I'll end up in the talk, that solar geoengineering will appear as one of the very few things that can still save climate politics as we know it. We've constructed that system that is culturally and materially unable to imagine futures that are meaningfully different. And that is because we've kept all kinds of things off the table that we just don't talk about. And we keep that off the table with what we call a dramaturgical regime, and I won't go into that too deeply, but it is a routinized set of performances and conventions through which politics are enacted. It is all the ways that you are supposed to behave to get influence in politics. And it is, in its very basic, it's me thinking this morning, what should I wear? I don't know exactly where I'm going. How do I get taken seriously? But it's also a climate modeler or an integrated assessment modeler thinking, well, if I put lifestyle change into my model, no one will listen to me. Right? Because it's been off the table. Right? In 1992, George Bush Sr. very famously said the American lifestyle is not up for debate. Well, if you want to do serious modeling for the future of the world, and you do put lifestyle in, you know that the Americans aren't going to listen, and to be quite frank, the Europeans are also not going to listen. So modelers started to also acquiesce to these kinds of strictures. So in any political system, and this is where I will stop, after this I'll stop with theory. In any political system, there is a set of rules and procedures about things that you can say with influence and things that are just not entertained. This is why you get, on the right-wing political spectrum, why they're so concerned with, if you've ever heard the term, the Overton window. Right? That's the range of political expression that we find acceptable. If you broaden that out, you get different kind of politics. Now that's where what we're interested in. In environmental politics, for a very long time, there has been only one way of making yourself really heard, and that was through the logic of ecological modernization. You have to suggest that there are positive sum solutions. You have to confine politics to policy making. And this is important, right? Because when you confine politics to policy making, it means that you can't talk about marketing, you can't talk about lifestyle. You can talk only about the things that you can solve with isolated policies. Specifically also, and this is where we get to the geoengineering part, you need to let natural sciences define the problem, and natural sciences should definitely not wade into questions of morality. Right? We all know that term, policy relevant, but you definitely cannot be policy prescriptive. Because then you're wading into the politics. So you have to cut political questions out from scientific questions, even where that doesn't work, such as in geoengineering. Now, that was a fairly deliberate political move. Because in the late 60s, when environmental politics started, environmental politics was deeply entangled with anti-Vietnam protests, with anti-nuclear protests, with all kinds of things that were actually deeply disruptive for the state. So Earth Day remains the single largest protest here in the US, with 15 million people participating, in a time where you had significantly less people in the first place, right? Over time, we've managed to isolate environmental politics back to things that are manageable for politics, up until roughly right now, right? We've done that by creating all kinds of words and ways of seeing the world that allow us to find isolated policy options for issues. Now, in the book, and I won't go into that, we say there's 8 confines, 8 mechanisms that have contributed to this issue. In the case of geoengineering, what I'm really concerned with for the rest of my presentation is political demarcation and political calibration. Because this is where the science meets the politics most explicitly. So political demarcation means some issues we just keep off the table. We don't talk about them. Lifestyle change always used to be one. That is changing a little bit. Economic growth is still not debatable. You will never find a climate policy model that is really taken seriously without growth in it. Political calibration is the sort of flip side of this. It is when scientists are starting to think about what the policymakers will want to hear. How can I make my research convincing to people? Why would people listen to me in the first place? So it's when policymakers implicitly calibrate, or when scientists implicitly calibrate their work to an imagined audience at the other side. And therefore, they do what we call self-policing. They're going to think critically about what can I say, what can I not say, because I want to stay relevant. Now, in that world of self-policing, our fear is that the logical, but mostly to me undesirable next step is geoengineering. And this is not necessarily geoengineering as isolated to solar radiation modification. It is the suggestion that we can save environmental politics, climate targets, for example, with speculative large-scale technologies. Because speculative large-scale technologies have always been very much at the heart of that idea of positive-sum solutions. If you want to have positive-sum solutions where no one has to lose anything, technology is typically where it's at. So this is where the layout is not so good anymore. In our prevailing dramaturgical regime, the political function of science is policy-oriented. We tailor our science, as I've been saying, to policy and not necessarily to further cultural change. So we legitimize those systems that are already in place. My claim is that we are all, and basically any scientist that I've ever met, complicit in maintaining the failures of environmental politics. I don't necessarily have a solution for this. This is a difficult part of my talk. But that's sort of where we're going with our ideas. And so when we think about geoengineering as a technology, whether it is stratospheric aerosol injection, whether it is marine cloud brightening, or we use it as a larger category to describe all kinds of other technologies as well, it is not just a technological fix for climate change. It is always, and it has always been, a particular way of relating to nature, a particular way of doing science, the result of a particular specific scientific infrastructure, and increasingly so, a response to a particular way of doing environmental politics. And at the heart of that is the fact that we have defined our entire environmental politics, or entire climate politics, around the idea of CO2 equivalent, which at the heart of it is very good science. There's nothing wrong with it. But when you start to look at the political effects that that has, it starts to become much more problematic, because it suggests that we have this one lever that we can pull, and if we do that, then we can solve our problems. It organizes a way in that it suggests that all the other things, cultural shifts, resource use, fairness, justice, all these things, are not in the base infrastructure and architecture of our climate politics. And so that allows for what I call pre-packaging solar radiation modification. Creating sort of neat little ways of talking about solar radiation modification that in the end, produce its inevitability. There's nothing about solar radiation modification inevitable in and of itself. It is only when it comes into this space where people reason in a particular way and where different people are creating sort of neat packages that you can take up and then put into the policy world. Now I'm going to give 4 short examples on this, but there are many more ways that this happens, right? So there's the depoliticization through scientific authority. There is extra statecraft, so prepackaging that happens beyond the official control of either science or states. Normalization through political calibration, and commercialization through startup engagement, which is the one I haven't really thought through most yet, because this is also a relatively new phenomenon. So that normalization through political authority, that's at the heart of how we talk about solar radiation modification. I think you cannot read any history of solar radiation modification without this intervention by Paul Crutzen in 2006, where he said, we need to start researching this. Everyone always says, before it was too controversial. After his authority, the messenger was the message, his authority opened it up. Now, as a historical narrative, that's actually quite problematic, because there was already predating policy interest and economic interest, especially here in the US. Already the Bush administration was using SRM as a reason to potentially do less mitigation. But as an effect, it is hard to deny. And after 2006, 2005, you see a massive increase in geoengineering research. Now, when you look at it in a bit more detail and a bit more attention to how that works, there's a fantastic paper by Arti Gupta and Ina Miller on de facto governance. Ways of governance that aren't officially meant to govern, but that then still condition people into reasoning a particular way. And so they analyzed the effect of these 2 huge, very formative reports, the Royal Society's 2009 assessment and the National Academy of Sciences 2 reports in 2015. So before this 2009 report, people who talked about solar geoengineering tended to be seen as very hubristic, as people who didn't really take the heart of climate change very seriously. There was, as David Keith always used to say, a taboo on this research, and Paul Crutzen broke it, but then this really happened, right? And this is really important, because I've been talking about the dramaturgical regime as something that pushes into view solar geoengineering, but it's, of course, it also works the other way. Right? If everyone's like, we're not touching that, we're not touching it. Now, this report sort of wiped off the table a lot of value questions and put on the table technical questions. This is what we ought to be thinking about. Not whether we should be doing it, but how we should be doing it. And then we can postpone the whether question for later. Then, the 2015 reports were much more explicit about that by saying, you know, basically we should think about the climate system, as a thermostat with 2 levers, CO2 and radiative forcing. That's respectively the topic of these 2 reports, right? So they then, again, really zoomed in on the technical questions. And as a result, and also as a result of the authorities' these reports and the way that we all started talking about it, and I was definitely part of that, all these value-based questions, political questions, became sort of submerged in technical language. To such an extent that we now have to really fight to put those questions back on the table. And that, since that entire architecture of climate politics, right? That's what I was talking about. The entire architecture of climate politics is built on that idea of CO2 equivalence, of that idea of having a single clear lever. This is very attractive, this way of talking to policymakers, to negotiators. It is also very attractive to them because it gives them a very clear way of going forward. I can solve it because I can point to this. So this is where the science becomes what we call performative, where it comes to have political effects where we're really uncomfortable with it. Now, you can see that most clearly, how that works, in what we call normalization through political calibration. I don't know who here knows this image, but I'm guessing a lot of you. This was a sort of integrative image from the 2018 IPCC report on 1.5 degree. And the crux is here. These are all integrated assessment models for how can we still make that 1.5 degree target. And as you can see, nearly all of them suggest a very, very deep net negative amount of emissions. Some outliers even like minus 25 gigatons by the end of the century. Now, this was the result of these modelers knowing that certain things were off the table. What was not in there, a serious discussion of economic growth. Every single country in all of these models grew by at least 1 or 2% economically. What was not in there was a serious question of, will these technologies really develop as well as our models suggest that they will? There was a discount rate, meaning that every year postponed, things would be cheaper. And finally, things that weren't in there were questions of cultural value, lifestyle change, for example. All was off the table. So in the models, very quickly you got to a situation in which CO2 removal technologies were just more interesting, more financially optimal than other options. So the models started to project a future where we use CDR instead of other mitigation methods. Now this, again, this is a very convenient message if you're a politician or a policymaker, right? Because it pushes the can down the road. Between the moment that I started my PhD, 2015, and I finished, early 2019, geoengineering as a category changed from including both CDR and SRM to basically only being about SRM. And this image, I think for me, is one of the most influential images that made that happen. Now the question is, for me, is how do we prevent a similar depoliticized way of normalizing SRM? It also made it possible for people like Vicky Holub, who is the CEO of Occidental Oil, to say that CDR gives our industry a license to continue to operate for the next 60, 70, 80 years. And so it normalizes it to such an extent that that becomes the way of reasoning about it. Now, third, extra statecraft. There are all kinds of ways, all kinds of institutions that create the governance structure of our societies that we don't think about as doing so. And I think the best example of this is the International Standards Organization. Because basically everything that you are now using, whether it's your phone, whether it's your laptop, whether it's the fork that you use to eat, whether it's the thickness of your credit card, all of it is standardized by the International Standards Organization. That is a hugely influential political role, right? But it's a private organization. It is a private collaboration between standards organizations in different countries. How they come to their standards is completely untransparent. To get into those rooms is almost impossible if you're not part of the negotiation. And in recent years, they have sort of branched out from standardizing the thickness of a credit card, which I'm sure we all agree is quite pleasant, to governance standards. And that's where it gets really scary. Because a couple of years ago, in 2019, someone leaked, and no one knows who leaked, but it was probably some of the Europeans in the negotiation, that they were trying to make a radiative forcing standard. And the radiative forcing standard would replace their previous climate standard. The claim was, yeah, that's just more accurate, because if we have a radiative forcing standard, we can see both positive and negative forces. The fear for people like me was, well, if you put that in the ISO, you immediately have a way for all companies in the world to say, we are climate neutral, because we have this sulfur thing that we use to pollute that offsets our CO2 emissions. Now this failed because of that leak, but there are so many of these instances of politics that happen beyond what we think are politics. This is where my real fear comes from about solar radiation modification research. Because whose research was cited mostly in these kinds of things? It was the stuff that was done here, right? And the stuff done by Doug Maarten. So your research on this may inadvertently lead to this kind of stuff. And this is why I keep saying you have to be really careful about how you do your modeling, and have to be really careful, it's that banal, about how you title your articles. Because these people don't read your articles, by and large, they read your title, and then that's interesting. Now, finally, that's sort of where I'll close, you now see this space kind of being taken over to some extent by all these companies who have a really flashy way of presenting themselves. Right? This is Make Sunsets. Then you have the Stardust Solutions in Israel that I couldn't put in because my burner laptop didn't allow me to. And you've got these weird in-between spaces like ARIA, the Advanced Research and Invention Agency in England, funding this in ways that sort of are in between what to me feels as commercialization and proper research. Now, so to me, that suggests that there is a sort of funnel that solar radiation modification is now getting into that works against transformational change, against the things that we, I think, all in this room, however our politics are divided, say, well, we need that, less resource use, less climate impact, in which solar geoengineering provides or sort of presents itself as a neat, well-defined solution, not because anyone really thinks it is, but because of the forces that are in that political system, sort of create the image of it, the spectacle of what solar geoengineering can be. And it creates the suggestion, and I can't believe this is something that we still have to say, and I guess you all agree, that solar geoengineering can save climate politics. Right? This is again why I'm very uncomfortable with using climate targets as a reasoning around solar radiation modification. Because a 1.5 degree that you might make with solar geoengineering is not a saved climate. It might be less bad than letting it run, but it's not a saved climate. And no one here in the room might think that, but I guarantee you that if you go out to negotiators and policymakers, they will think that because they don't really understand the nuances of what we're talking about. So, to conclude, unfortunately, solar geoengineering is increasingly accepted as a technology of last resort. A technology of last resort, not necessarily in the way that we might all imagine it, when things really when shit really hits the fan, we might still have this. So, a technology of last resort to suggest that climate politics can still succeed. And in that logic, solar and geoengineering, how much we think it is not a radical option, right? It's an extension of business as usual. And that's really all I came here to do. I don't expect you to agree with me on the implications of what I say. And I think we all have different ideas about where we should do research, when we should police research, when we shouldn't. But we should take those forces much more seriously than we've done so far. And the fact that we all, every single one of us in this room, plays into those forces with all of the little things that we do. Whether it will be any one of us thinking, well, if I use this title, it gets more clicks, or if I say this to the policymaker, if I suggest it a little bit more, that it will work, they will listen to me. You're creating a sort of machine that you cannot get out of anymore. Thank you. I will leave it
Right there.
Yeah, so I mean, I really enjoyed your sort of like dramaturgical regime frame of discussing this. I think as far as climate politics goes, like over the last 20, 30 years, just as we've seen the stabilization of solar geoengineering and like political discourse, at the same time, I think we've seen like also a rise in like new ecological movements elsewhere around the world. Like for example, like the sort of revived indigenous rights movement, like, you know, Fridays for the Future and like the Global North, other movements elsewhere. Like, what role do you think these sort of new social movements play in creating a sort of new narrative around solar geoengineering, a new sort of vision of climate politics more broadly?
That's a very good question. I think the sort of glib first answer to that is that really remains to be seen. It's to me unclear at this point. I think the people who are at this point having more influence in reshaping the solar geoengineering space are the people we might all feel uncomfortable with them doing it. And it's a lot of the tech funding with a very particular ideology. I think for us in the book, right, the real question was not why don't these alternative ways of talking about it exist? Because clearly they exist, they've always existed. They've gone up and down a little bit, but why do they never manage to actually have policy influence? And so that's where we think that dramaturgical regime, where everyone sort of works away all the radical edges over time, plays that out. Now, in our current time frame, I really don't know where it's going to go. And we end the book with saying we're sort of at an epochal shift. This thing that we had, climate politics, maybe even Western modernity as a whole, we can see it unraveling before our eyes, right? But it's very unclear what is coming afterwards. So it's also a time where much more political agency is possible than there was 10, 15, and certainly 30 years ago. That sort of...
Anybody else? Questions or comments? Yeah, back there.
You mentioned about solar engineering being the last resort. So now, my concern is about the cost of it. Now, from what I have seen, only selective European countries and US, so now I don't know about Canada, we talk about the climate change. I have not heard such a concern in what you call developing countries or underdeveloped countries, because for them this is not a priority. So now, in your opinion, do you think when things are becoming very bad, will all the countries join? Because this is how far this is cost effective. So that's what I'm driving at.
So let me make sure that I understand your question correctly. And so if things get really bad, we start collectively, globally doing this, will people join, and to what extent is it cost effective? That's your question? So I'm going to preface my answer by saying that I'm probably not the expert on that particular question in the room. But my sense is, first, that the question of cost effectiveness is not the question that should be on the table with these kinds of technology. And the fact that we've organized our entire climate politics around the question of cost effectiveness has all kinds of bizarre and frankly unconscionable sort of outflows. From the ways that these integrated assessment models define marginal lands as lands that have no big economic productivity, but there are actually people living on them, but we'll just kick them off, right? So with SRM, I think that risk, because it suggests that it's quite cheap, is even bigger. And it's very easy to make it look good economically. Now the question, will all the countries join together? I think the simple answer is, I find that extremely unlikely. And that's not even including your very valid concern about Global South countries not having a serious voice in this debate. But this is not, from the perspective of a state, this is not a climate technology. This is a political and geopolitical tool that you can use to also gain influence. So there is, I think it's extremely unlikely that we are going to do this collectively for the global common good. I just don't see that happening. I see it much more likely as a sort of power play in between all these major powers, which, by the way, is how people started thinking about solar geoengineering back in the 50s and 60s. Right? That's when they saw it as the new frontier for the Cold War. So that idea has always been there. We've just so internalized the idea that it comes from climate backgrounds. That sort of.
I've got a question for you. I'll proceed and then I'll cede the floor. So one way one could sort of interpret what you were talking about is that we're kind of on our way towards doing geoengineering, even if we don't want to. It's sort of the logical endpoint of what we've constructed. There's a sort of inevitability to it, almost a triumphalism to it. What would you say to researchers who say, well, but we're not taken seriously, so we can't get any experiments off the ground in the field? We're still treated as sort of controversial folks who have, grabbed a taboo, who are in the ghetto in some sense. We can't get federal funding. What do you say to people who respond with that kind of a message?
Yeah. So I think the first thing is, it is not inevitable. Right? It's far from inevitable. I'm thinking we're making it. Two, that's a very important point that I want to keep making. To those researchers, I would say you have to find ways to disconnect your own personal experience around feeling in the wilderness, around this, which to some extent might even be true, from the larger political and social drivers that are pushing this into view. Because it doesn't matter politically whether you've done the Scopus experiment or any other experiment. Excuse my language, no one's going to give a shit. Like, do you think Trump is going to care if he gets this into his head? Do you think that for these geopolitical purposes, the real question isn't even if it works. The real question is, can you make people think it works? And can you use it to strong arm people? For climate politics, for the suggestion of climate politics, it might even almost be favorable that it's sort of open, because it suggests, well, we still have this technology, which is what happened to CDR, right? We still have this technology. Well, everyone who had seriously looked into that knew it wasn't going to be the saving grace that we now pretend it is. So you have to disconnect that experience and your own way of looking at it from the larger playing field, and then think about it critically. That's what I would say.
So I have, I guess, a small suite of questions about something I know very little about, which is perhaps a bad idea. So first I'm going to ask you the question about what I know very little about, which is this whole thing is about solar geoengineering governance, and questions of not only like how are we imagining solar geoengineering into our current climate politics, but are we imagining modes of governing solar geoengineering, and kind of how does that fit into the dramaturgical framework? So, like that's the first question is like, what is happening? Are people talking about like structures for governing solar geoengineering if it, if and when in the inevitability theory, it becomes a major part of our, on the ground action rather than just kind of this imaginary that's fueling climate politics as it is. So is that happening? The second question is like, do you see that fitting into the kind of dramaturgical framework? And then the third question is like, where, I'm trying to figure out how to formulate this. Where do shifts in governance, okay, so again, this is a bad idea. Solar geoengineering as a last resort in this kind of imaginary of climate politics, where it solves our climate politics problems. Assume it doesn't, because I kind of think that that's where this goes. Climate politics breaks. Where does governance go when climate politics breaks?
It wasn't that bad of an idea to ask these questions. They're all very good. Okay, remind me of your first one, because I got distracted by the last one.
The first question is like, are people talking about solar geoengineering governance?
Oh, yes. Clearly, yes. Actually, the reason that I'm here is because Josh is organizing a conference on this next week, I think, in Chicago, with a lot of people who have different views on this. So that happens a lot. What I find, where I have my issues with it, is that it all, up until quite recently, and by that I mean 3, 4, 5 years ago, it was all the imagination was of a sort of rules-based international order where everyone kind of plays by the rules. Just nothing, there weren't any serious, either for the research side of it or for the implementation side of it, governance proposals that were about, okay, so what if people don't play by the rules? How are we going to deal with this? And that, to me, as a political scientist and science technology studies scholar, was like, okay, people never play by the rules. Right? So I think that was the key sort of issue that I have. Then the second question, how does it fit into? Well, that's partially sort of within what I just said. I think, again, that's kind of open for debate. And it's really not that clear yet. I genuinely just don't know, and I think that's sort of the conversation that we ought to be having. How do we fit it in a way that is robust enough to survive an era in which maybe liberal democracy isn't the rule of the land anymore, right? Then for the third question, basically, what happens after climate politics fails and falls apart? Everyone always asks my co-author and me, how was it like writing together? And I think we had like 95% agreement on the analysis, and then what happens next? Fundamental disagreements. Because he loves incremental solutions a lot more. And I'm thinking, well, maybe this has failed so badly that we need to rethink fundamentally. And I don't know where that goes. But now we've ceded the cultural space around climate so clearly to the backlash side of it. It's been so much easier to demonize it than to make it sound appealing. And that's our failure, and that's also the failure of environmental politics. So I don't know where that goes, but that's what we ought to be building together.
Quick question on what's happening in the EU with the omnibus bill around regulations for businesses and finance. So there was a big push to create a very complex regime, and European, French and German companies have pushed back hard on that. You could almost say that was like an imaginary in the creation of it, and as they thought about actually implementing it, it all collapsed. I'm just wondering if you have studied that and how that informs your view of geoengineering.
No, I have not studied that in any detail. what I can say, but it's very superficial, is that the logic of that still was very much in that ecological modernization, positive sum solution idea, and then companies rightly started saying, well, this isn't actually a positive sum solution. And then you also see this with the backlash all the time. You get all of these promises that it doesn't have to hurt you so much, but then we implement the text, and of course it hurts. It's not clear what you get back from it. And I think that sort of informed the backlash, but I haven't studied it in any great detail and can't help you there.
The concept of geoengineering scares many people. Is there a way that you can sell people on doing the individual things that we need to do without mentioning this scary concept?
When you say the things that we need to do you mean the mitigation efforts? Or?
What I mean is that when you read in the press about geoengineering, immediately everyone gets scared, and it's difficult to sell them on that. Can you find a way to sell people without using the concept of geoengineering?
I'm not sure if I would want to, if it's about geoengineering. And I think that should be scary. I think my issue is that we're finding all kinds of ways of not making it scary. If we had a serious debate about it politically, right, where we're saying this is super scary and we're still doing it, then maybe I would never have considered writing that non-use agreement piece. I think the problem is that once there is this sort of in-between space where people get scared, but there are all the social mechanisms that sort of take away the fear. If we can keep in the fear, then we can do the research. That's sort of where I have no solution, but so I hope I am understanding your question correctly, but that's how I see it.
Thank you. But I just want to call out to the moderator, if we could hear non-male voices, that would be useful. But I do have a question for the speaker.
I'm searching, yeah.
Okay. So the gentleman here just was describing the issue with European environmental regulations. I come from the realm of ESG reporting for corporates, mostly in North America. To me, this idea that there's an imaginary around, like, we want this type of solution, and then when we try to, it fails. This is a collective action problem in my mind, that if everyone does comply, we can achieve something better for everyone, but it's very easy to fall off the bus and try to do your own thing. Solar geoengineering seems to have the potential of a radical or a small state with a significant budget to do something that has what could be perceived as positive externalities. Like the solution would be for everybody, even though just a small group is driving it. How do you see the dramaturgical, the stage of world actors setting the tone for what's feasible, but the idea of a rogue party, whether it's a billionaire or a state, pushing this into the realm as a collective solution? Can you speak to that collective action problem and its flip side?
Yeah. I'm trying to figure out where I'll start, but I think let me start by at the end. Like, how do we deal, or how should we think about the stage of world politics and potential rogue actors, which is a very real issue, because it's less of a collective action problem. I'll get to that in a second.
If I may add just, my framing is from the Ministry for the Future, the Children of Kali, as a terrorist or eco-terrorist group that shoots airplanes out of the sky randomly and then ends commercial aviation effectively in a science fiction world. So thinking about the potential of solar geoengineering as a similarly wide, it affects everything, but doesn't have to be done by everyone.
Yeah, no, so it doesn't have to be done by everyone, but realistically, it has to be condoned in some way, shape, or form by at least the people with the power to stop. So there's a an American IR scholar in this space, Danielle Young, who keeps saying, well, there's realistically really only one actor at this point who can do it, and that's the US. Because you have the basis around the world to actually implement stratospheric aerosol injection. I think the more important question to me is, what kind of world, politically, discursively, we live in at the moment that happens? I really worry about these rogue actors, but mostly because I think there's enough within the system for them to help sell their message. But if we had a different culture, that would be extremely difficult. If everyone sort of felt like it the way the people in Germany feel about it, it's very hard to sell that. That would not happen globally, right? So it's easy to think about this, and this is where I'll get back to the collective action problem. If we think about it as in frames of rational actors, I think what we lose is culture, and how much what we think are our interests are actually what we would call them discursively constituted. And the most easy example for me maintains, how did we get to be in a culture that does not value self-preservation as self-interest, but does value economic growth as self-interest? That is a cultural question, and that's a discursive question. So by framing it as a collective action problem, which it surely also is, you lose that whole cultural side of it. And I think that's where I'm sort of uneasy with the framing of the question.
Great, thank you. So I'm very much in agreement and concerned about the way that contemporary climate politics, and especially integrated assessment modeling, just rules out various options, takes them off the table. But I wonder what you think about reasoning more explicitly on non-ideal terms. So saying, look, let's hold constant in our reasoning that there won't be a movement towards degrowth over the next 5 to 10 years. There won't be massive lifestyle change. We can even say that that's what ought to be done, but let's hold constant that it won't be. What is the role for solar geoengineering under those assumptions? And maybe you say that even reasoning in that way produces the lack of feasibility around degrowth and lifestyle change, etc. Not totally convinced by that way of going, but I guess generally just wondering what you think about holding those things constant and doing so explicitly, because the problem, right, with integrated assessment models is it's doing it. It's taking those options off the table without saying that it's doing so, right?
Yeah, so I think this is, you're sort of hitting at what for me is the most difficult question, sort of morally and politically, in determining where I stand on this. Because I can follow your line of thinking here. I do actually think by making that argument, you're organizing out all of the other things. But that isn't in and of itself a reason to throw solar geoengineering off the table altogether. And I keep going back and forth. And I think in the debate as a whole, I think there are two fundamental hypocrisies that really piss me off. On the side of, let's call it the pro-geoengineering camp, it's this insistence still that a reasonable form of governing this is possible or likely, almost likely, and sort of correlated to that mitigation deterrence isn't proven yet. Well, it's not proven, but you're never going to prove it until after the fact, and of course it's going to happen. Let's be honest about that. Of course, at least to some extent that's going to happen. On the other side, the camp that I'm usually put into, because my name is on that non-use agreement, maintaining that there isn't going to be a world in which we want to be implementing this is just woefully naive. I can imagine so many worlds in which I'd rather have done research into this. If all of that's true, I don't exactly know where I land politically. And this is, I think, the most difficult thing. Why I ended up saying, well, we need to push the brakes, because I think actually for me the mitigation deterrence problem at this point is more urgent than the problem of, are we going to have done the research at the time that I want to do it? But tomorrow I might give a different answer, right? Honestly.
One more question. Yeah, hand over there. Do one more question.
Thanks very much. I have lots of questions, but I'm going to focus on one just because I'm curious on your thoughts. You talk about the sort of political environment, but then also, which I think rightly so, point to sort of the private interests and or motivations or funders around this. My question is around sort of the relationship between the two. So ultimately, if we're thinking about who's driving the bus and who's making the decisions around this, where do you see that intersection point, and ultimately what does that mean for sort of to driving an informed discussion about governance, if that makes sense?
Yeah, it's again a very difficult question that makes me want to give a cop-out answer, right? But so I think that the really fundamentally important part of what we're trying to get at here is that there won't be a decision maker. There will be people with more power to influence and people with less power, but who makes the decisions, that's very opaque. And if we're talking about, I don't think, if you went back to 2009 and you asked all these people from the Royal Society, do you understand how this is going to configure the debate for 30 years? They probably would say no. But it has had a huge influence on the way that we've categorized, thought about it, the way that it's gotten into policy documents, all of it. Right? Had you asked me 2 years ago, 3 years ago, if I could really understand the sort of impact of the non-use agreement, no. Now, that isn't to say that there are clearly sort of links between the private actors and government actors and rogue actors that I think we should be really concerned about. But I can't really put my finger on like, whose hands are going to be on the thermostat. Because I think, and it's also sort of intellectual curiosity kind of thing for me. And I'm interested in how things become normal. So that's the dynamic that I study. The other side I leave to people like Josh and other people in this room probably who do that endlessly better than I can do.
Let's give a round of applause for Jeroen. Thank you very much, Jeroen. We'll be around.